Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the Supernatural series finale. Not necessarily like, because obviously I already reviewed it, but obviously I want to talk more about the fact is that from what I picked up, and this isn't like a encapsulating thing that like, oh, I've asked every fan, but it's actually interesting that there's been a little bit of pushback and kind of like quite a few fans being upset by the series finale. Like obviously, like I talked about it, I did my review of it. I actually really enjoyed it, but I know that doesn't apply to everyone. I've talked about it before. I'm always in my little nerdy bubble where it's like, oh, if I enjoy something, I just assume everyone else enjoys it. But I'm like, oh yeah, everyone's gonna like what they like. So, but it's something I have to always kind of remind myself. I'm not blaming, like, if you didn't like the series finale, okay, I'm not gonna be like, oh, how dare you. But it's just such an interesting thing. Like I said, because I'm always in my bubble, I was like, oh, I enjoyed it. It made me cry. I thought it was a beautiful ending, but obviously, like, in the context of the ending, I can tell, like, obviously, like, some people probably wouldn't like that type of ending. So the reason why this even got sparked in my head to have as video is because I was watching at the time of recording this, because like Supernatural ended last week, like literally the final episode ended like last week. The most recent Fat Man Beyond, at the time of recording this, they got on a conversation of Supernatural, and Kevin had said that he had seen like quite a few people who weren't too happy about the series finale. And even him and Mark had joked about the fact is like, oh, not wanting an actual, you want a show until you get to this point where it's like, oh yeah, people say you suck because the fact is you didn't land the show's ending or whatever. Because obviously, like, an ending is always, I feel like, always the hardest thing to land. Like, there's some people that'll be satisfied. There's gonna be quite a few. Because there was even people, Kevin was responding to some people in the chat. Like, I think there was even one person who even compared it to like Game of Thrones. Like, obviously, that's what you hear most about Game of Thrones. It's like, yeah, this and that were great, but it's like all that final season, all that final, like, they didn't stick the landing. Is kind of like the whole point. And there's a handful of shows people will be like, oh, that show didn't stick the landing. Like, I think, my personal opinion, and I left a comment saying this, I think there's probably only like a handful of shows that probably have a ending that everyone, if not even just majority of the fan base like. Once again, this is coming from me hearing this from the opinion of a few people. I also heard some people who were like, oh yeah, they liked it, but it was just, I don't usually venture out, so I don't know how the entire fan base feels about it, whether it's half and half, whether it's more like 70-30, like, I don't know how the ratio of that whole situation, how most people felt about it. Obviously, I'd love to get to know your thoughts, in the comments down below, but I think the reason why the ending kind of, like, I think the reason why it kind of sat okay with me is because, and I talked about this, and someone else had said it too, the finale is kind of like an epilogue, because everything was literally like resolved in episode 19, and this was more like an epilogue. It actually, I think I talked about this in my review, it definitely reminded me a little bit of Lost, because Lost kind of has a similar ending, spoilers, the whole like afterlife thing, so it heavily reminded me of Lost, which I know that's not the best comparison to make, because a lot of people did not like how Lost ended, but to be fair, that was like conjoined with like so much other stuff, it's like not getting the answers they wanted. This was just, but I think for most people it was just like they didn't like these characters ending this way. And I guess in my opinion it feels like it's very true to the story, because they had the life of hunters, and like your life could go sideways at any point in time. But I think it's more so like the gut punch of like, you literally had everything resolved, they had their entire lives before them, and you struck Dean down before like he really got to fully enjoy. But I think that's the whole point of it. I mean, like, because obviously, like, they saw what life was, like, after their mom died, what that did to their dad, and, how that life of a hunter can, like, because they've had more than one chance, because even Dean was like, hey, don't bring me back to life. We know how that does not always work out. But so I think it's beautiful in its own right, because I think it did give Sam the opportunity, like, hey, I need to live, not just for myself, but for, obviously not just for everyone we lost, but for my brother. I got to live for him. I got to keep living, because I told him it's okay for him to let go, because I'll be okay, so that, but also like obviously the whole heaven situation, because I'm sure people probably like, it's probably one of those things where it's like you want it to be more of a happy ending, where it's like, Sam and Dean, everything works out for them. It's like if you want to go to the future and then be reunited with everyone, like, at the very end. Because I think Kev and Mark were talking about the 6 Feet Under. I've never seen this show, but I've heard people talk about the series finale, where you kind of see how everyone's story ends up, the rest, kind of like probably like a montage of the rest of their lives, and then like them dying. So people probably want, like, what you got with Sam, if you probably got more of that, like with Sam and Dean, and then got them reunited with Bobby at the end of it all. Probably wouldn't hurt to be able to see Jack and Cassio one more time. That probably would play a part in it as well. But because I think Kevin had even said like Jensen Ackles initially wasn't too happy about it, but then like some people had talked to him and he kind of like came around on it. But it's still like, it's just an interesting thing. Like to me, like I can recognize aspects of this ending being like, oh, I could see how that could upset people in certain regards. You know, I mean, and that's me just pulling from it. Like some of the stuff I mentioned might not even be the reason why some fans were. I mean, because it's also a thing of like this finale has been built up over 15 years. The show has been going for 15 years. So like, well, you built up a strong fan base for that 15 years. At the ending, you know, that's what I think it's even harder when the show runs that long, like whether, you know, sticking the landing. It's actually, because I even commented on it, it kind of reminded me of Arrow's ending. And because earlier I'd said someone had compared it to an epilogue, and it's like Arrow's ending's more of an epilogue because like everything got resolved in a Crisis on Infinite Earths crossover, especially like Oliver's story. Episode 9 was more so like set up for the potential Arrow spin-off with Mia, and then like the 10th episode was just kind of an epilogue, just kind of saying goodbye, kind of seeing where everyone ended up. And I think probably people would want more of that because obviously, I mean, to be fair, like I said it at the time, like this, it was very, it all coming full circle because it was always about the relationship. So for it to be them at the end makes a lot of sense. But it's like, it's that thing of you would want to see other people's stories too. Like obviously you hear a little bit about like obviously John and Mary and Cass and Jack. But even then it's still not, you don't probably get the full closure you want. To a certain extent, I'm sure that probably plays a role in it to a certain extent. But like I said, these are just kind of my thoughts about it. Like it's always an interesting conversation because I've talked about it a handful of times. Like, you know, series finale. Like I said, I think still currently 12 Monkeys, the TV show, has my favorite series finale. But even people were saying like, yeah, you could look at that in a bit of a depressing way too. I don't. It didn't even cross my mind to think that. I was like, oh, I look at it from an optimistic point of view. But now in retrospect, I'm like, I can see some pessimistic aspects to that ending if you look at it in a, you know, it's like, oh, happy and it could be sad in certain regard. So same thing with this. Like obviously there's an aspect of like you wish that Sam and Dean were able to grow old together, that Dean, especially out of anyone, Dean, because Dean was always like, you know, because Cassie Olevian told him like in episode, what was it, 18 I want to say, was like, people look at you as your dad's blunt instrument, that you're just like this killer or whatever, but that's not who you are. Like even after all that he lost, all that he sacrificed, always being the one that was, you know, because Sam got a little bit of that life. Dean had moments over the course of the series, but you would want him to have, not saying like, oh, Sam should die and Dean should live, not that in shape or form, because it's also like, you know, Dean being the bigger brother, always looking out for his little brother, even being a little envious of his big little brother having to be able to just kind of get away from everything. It's like, I think that's probably even more so why for Dean, it's like, you were able to get away from this life until I kind of brought you back into it. So you out of anyone could. I mean, granted, Sam has had chances. It didn't always stick the landing, you know, having a life outside of all this. I mean, granted, his life was still mixed up in it, as we can tell. His son, obviously his son grew up a hunter because he's got the tattoo, like, oh, so you'll get possessed. I mean, it's like that world, the supernatural stuff in that world still exists, so you still got to prepare yourself and train your family up for it. So like I said, it's just, these are just some of the things going through my mind. Like I brought up earlier, I'd love to get to know your thoughts about it. Did you like the series finale of Supernatural? Did you not? What were some of the reasons you did like it, or some of the reasons you didn't like it? I'd love to get to know you. I'd love to have this conversation with some people, kind of break down, you know, some of their thoughts about it. I'm probably look up some stuff, you know, in forums and stuff like that to kind of get a little more feedback about, you know, where a lot of the fans potentially stand on this. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good